Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. And so this week, I'm joined by Stuart Welsh. Hi, Stuart. How are you?
Hi, Kieran. I'm very well, thank you, and thanks for having me on.
Always a pleasure, Stuart. Always a pleasure. And we're going to explore something that you've been doing in classrooms and schools recently in an attempt to support schools in their professional development. And I suppose it's something that we've decided to call iterative learning or iterative lesson design. Let's start with definitions. What are we talking about when we say iterative lesson design?
Okay, Kieran. So what we're looking at doing here is trying to sort of establish a model of PD for teachers that ultimately becomes embedded into their sort of PD cycle, something that they can do for themselves. But in the initial stage, obviously, we're there to provide input and structure and get a sense of what this is aiming to achieve. And the way it looks really, it's a little bit like a sort of lesson study or learning study in the sense that a group of teachers of a given year group will get together and work to plan a mini lesson. And this lesson will have a very specific focus, an element of pedagogy or practice that we're wanting to work on and learn about. And essentially, there'll be a model or demonstration lesson, just a mini lesson though, so maybe 15 or 20 minutes long. And all the teachers will observe that. Then there'll be a period of sort of reflection where we'll chat about what we saw and what happened. And then one of the other teachers involved in the process will then basically teach a version of that lesson, so the same lesson or an iteration on that first lesson. And then there'll be some reflection with the group again, and then that cycle kind of continues so that all the teachers involved in this process get a chance to sort of teach the lesson. And I think the things that are important to note here for people that are listening and watching and are maybe thinking about how might this work, we're taking basically just half a dozen students from a class at any one time. So they'll be extracted from class, they'll take part in this 15-minute mini lesson, and then they'll go back to their classes. And when it comes to the second iteration of teaching this lesson, another group of 6 or 7 or 8 students will come. And so in that way, the whole group of students can experience the same thing, but it gives the teachers a chance to sort of iterate and learn from the process. So hopefully I've explained it reasonably well.
I think so. I think it's really clear. You're essentially taking this model idea and then trying to refine it with colleagues. But whereas the lesson study takes place over a number of weeks and a number of lessons, this is almost it's truncated, which I think has in common with learning study. But I was part of a learning study group maybe 8 or 9 years ago with the colleague called Laurie Jakes, and I know Laurie thinks really deeply, and she will have a definition for learning studies. There's no way we're saying this is learning study, but equally, you've taken my recollection of this experience and made it into something that is very much that works for you in the context in which you've tried to apply it, I think.
And it's probably worth adding in, just now that this is something I've been working on with a few different groups of teachers in different schools. One of those schools into their sort of second year of this, and it looks different now to the way it did at the very beginning. So I think when it was a new experience, I was very much leading the planning at the very beginning in the initial stage, and I was very much leading this kind of first, almost a demonstration type lesson. But as time's gone on and those teachers have sort of grown more familiar with the format and also just more confident in general with what we're working on, we have started to share the planning a lot more, and that's really produced some very rich conversations. So more and more I'm saying to teachers, what is it that we're looking to achieve through this? What do we want the students to be able to do? And we've been using manipulatives, coloured rods recently, and how might we use these? So I've really been putting the teachers out of their comfort zone and making them think as you would do if you were on your own here. But obviously I'm there to give them a bit of scaffolding and a bit of prompting. So it's evolved over time, and ideally the plan would be that in another year or so, these teachers are then able to look at their own pool of sort of collective expertise, and for somebody else to say, well, I want to examine this new theme or this new approach or this new element of pedagogy, so let's sit together, let's go through this iterative cycle together again. I think wonderfully powerful model of collaborative PD, and really, really relevant to context, because it's your students in your school, which I think is sometimes lacking from maybe more generic PD that isn't perhaps tailored to context.
Yeah, and with time being a premium in schools, having the fact that we can have all the benefit of this collaborative planning or collaborative sort of support for each other, but in like a truncated version, so it's a morning. I think that makes it much more accessible for schools. I think something we can, I think it's worth us going in depth into, sort of what are the elements, but also the real benefits of this.
If you're listening to this podcast, you already care about great maths teaching. Now, the Story of Mathematics is a complete primary curriculum designed by teachers for teachers. It connects representation, reasoning, and proof so that every lesson builds true understanding, not just performance. Professional development is built in, helping teachers grow in confidence as students grow in proficiency. And you can find out more, book a short tour at alta-education.com/TSOM-overview.
When the same lesson is retaught and refined, are there things that you deliberately hold constant? And are there things you allow to vary? It's almost like variation theory kind of thing, but not quite. And how do you rule out the improvements that are just the kids being familiar with tasks or the teacher being familiar with the task, rather than actual tweaks you've made that have made the activity or the task better?
Yeah, I think that there's a danger that teachers involved in this process are maybe just going to try and mimic or replicate a model lesson that was done, and to some extent that's not a bad thing to do if there's a framework and a blueprint there. But really what we're trying to do is get the teachers to analyze that first model lesson and say, well, where were the strengths? What was this representation that was used? How was this introduced? What was the vocabulary, and how were the tasks then structured and scaffolded? So getting the teachers to think deeply about that, and then asking them what might have worked better. And sometimes those teachers, who know those students, because those are their students, will say, well, actually my group, they would respond well to a slightly different representation, or maybe a different use of color, or just a different introduction or kind of hook to get the concept going. And so we will then say, well, let's do that with the next group then. Let's make that purposeful change. And the rest of us will then look and try and reflect between the two. But I think in general, what has to remain constant is the desired aim. We want the group of students to be walking out after 15 minutes or 20 minutes, being able to do this thing, whatever our target is. And so I think that's always held constant. The representations, as I said, we've been spending a lot of time with coloured rods, relational rods, and so obviously that isn't going to change. I'm not going to be changing the representation because that's a big part of the PD. But the language around it, and possibly the repetition within a task. So when you're working with coloured rods, sometimes you might start a task with orange and then repeat it again with tan, and then maybe do it again. Sometimes teachers will just go straight to tan, for example. They've got a bit of flexibility and choice, but the general structure and pathway, I think, remains the same.
Yeah, because obviously, like, the better you know the ratio rods, the more informed your decision making can be. Instead of just using the white ones to represent everything, because you're getting like that one-to-one correspondence there, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen this because, I think we're probably all guilty of discovering a new to us kind of manipulative or representation, and then just trying to shoehorn it in everywhere and make it do everything and learn everything about it in a short space of time. But something as powerful as coloured rods, relational rods, it takes years to master. And I've been playing around with those coloured rods for years and years, and still figuring out new things that I can do with them. And so we must make sure that when we're taking this approach, that we commit to trying to learn it incrementally over time, and not trying to throw everything in there in one go and try and learn it all in one go. But what I've definitely noticed with the teachers, I've been doing this termly, and maybe you're going to talk about this a little bit later, but we've been doing this every term. And I've definitely noticed this just increased familiarity with the rods and the language around using the rods, and even noticed this increased sort of kind of confidence with trying different things with the rods and asking, well, how could I use it for this, and pushing themselves on. So it's worth taking time and going sort of step by step through this to build a deep knowledge of whatever it is that, the approach or the resource or the pedagogical approach that you're trying to focus on.
Yeah, that's the hallmark of any effective CPD, is when the person who's received the professional development becomes the master, almost like in a reverse Star Wars kind of situation. Although I've only ever seen the first 50 minutes, so I'm just running on cultural literacy as to what actually happens in that show.
We talk a lot in this show about using artificial intelligence purposefully. Now, if you want one place each week that helps you to do exactly that, try Teacher Prompts by Neil Almond. You get a clear briefing of what's changed in artificial intelligence, why it matters for schools, and a prompt you can test in your planning with our CPD. Tone is evidence-informed and pragmatic, with explainers like study mode, O3, and agents that make sense for classroom realities. It's free and it respects your time. Subscribe at news.teacherprompts.ai.
You've done this actually across pretty much, I want to say, all phases in sort of early and primary mathematics, and you've even got some of the secondary mob getting involved with you. So, like, does this transfer across? And are there conditions you need to be aware of? For like the adaptations for phase and stage and class composition? Because I know generally we're of the opinion that phase and stage are unhelpful distinctions. In the most part of mathematics. What sort of considerations you take in when you're thinking about this with, the reception in secondary, or even anywhere in between lower and upper primary?
So there's a few things that need to be kind of thought about carefully. Primary curriculum, primary teachers are incredibly busy, and whereas secondary teachers with that sort of different structure to their timetable will have designated non-contact periods in a day. Now, it can sometimes be a bit of a lottery whether there's ever a period in the week where all of the secondary teachers are off or free at the same time. But in the secondary setting, I think that's the powerful thing. You can find a slot to sort of all sit and do this together. Whereas in primary, it's very difficult to sort of shuffle around time and teachers and get cover, etc. So I think what's worked reasonably well, and sometimes I feel sorry for the students, but they get extracted from something like PE, where they're maybe being taken by a different teacher anyway. And so we take half a dozen students from a PE lesson when the teacher would not be teaching them. So it's very important that schools and school leadership invest in this and say, well, we are going to provide a bit of extra time or a bit of additional personnel to allow teachers to be released to go through this process. So that's two big differences between primary and secondary straight away. In terms of the model that I'm describing, this idea of trying to get to the stage where you're kind of co-creating the lesson and then going through this iterative cycle, I think it transfers really quite nicely from teachers of the youngest students all the way into secondary. The only thing that's kind of shifting around there is the complexity of the mathematics that you're actually kind of broaching. But what has been really interesting for me is that I think secondary teachers, I don't want to be making any sort of sweeping statements here, but there might be a sense that manipulatives and some representations are perhaps kind of time for them is past, and secondary's here and it's all formal written algorithms and everything's abstract. And I think that there are potentially a lot of students who would really benefit from increased exposure to sort of manipulatives, etc. And so this iterative learning design or iterative lesson design approach here can be equally powerful across the whole of schooling. And it might not even be manipulatives. It doesn't need to be that is the focus at all. It could be a focus on questioning and sort of deeper thought questioning. And again, that transfers all the way through. It just the level will change depending on the students. But of course, that's why you bring in teachers of a given year group to work on it together.
Manipulators are so easy to come to mind because that's what everyone's asking about, isn't it? No matter where we are in the world, it's how do we get the most of these manipulators, and it's through sustained thought about the mathematics, because there is no one source that says here are all the ways you can use manipulatives, go and learn them. You've really got to spend your time thinking, and some things are appropriate. So I can see why it's almost synonymous, and because lots of the people we're working with, they want this support in this area. I think, when you talk about the complexity, you obviously mean the most complex maths is in early years. You've almost started to touch on this. What sort of design choices make the model practical in real schools? Things like from timetabling, cover, psychological safety. I think when you're putting yourself on the line, I guess, is important. And how do you almost try and guard against the performative nature of this kind of stuff, and where it becomes almost like an observed lesson rather than a focus on long-term proficiency?
I think that is really, really key here, because there are definitely some environments where I think teachers are not super happy with others observing or watching, because maybe a past experience, things are judgmental. And so, like so many things in schools, I think it does boil down to kind of relationships and expectation setting. And you've got to build this environment where we're learning together. You've got to state that from the outset, I think, for teachers, and saying that we don't expect everybody to be experts at this stage, and that's why we're doing this. And I'm encouraging you to throw yourself into this, to sort of stretch your comfort zone in an environment where you're not being judged. And I think, from what I've seen, the classroom teachers that I work with, they're quite comfortable, perhaps because it's their peers, the other classroom teachers were just in this together, and some of them will plan together anyway, and so they maybe even support each other in lessons as it is. So the teachers that I've been working with seem to feel comfortable enough to give it a go. Something that I think definitely helps with that is the fact that I will go first, and that I will work with a group of students that I've perhaps never met before, but I will just put everything out there and then ask for feedback and say, I'm more than happy to hear your thoughts on this, and I'll discuss, elements and listen to the sort of thoughts and feedback before letting them have a go. But what I've found is that I think perhaps it's been the fact that it has been the coloured rods, but I'm sure it would be the same with any pedagogical approach, that the teachers are quite excited to give it a go. They actually want to give it a go. And having just half a dozen students in front of you rather than 30 definitely makes that easier. I think teachers are more comfortable to sort of experiment, because they're maybe not worrying so much in the back of their mind about attention and discipline and all the rest of it. I think it is important to say that we need to think, how does that scale to a whole class environment? And for some teachers, what they've been doing is continuing to use additional adults to help them. And then they maybe do take a group of 6 or 8 or 10 and work with just a subset of the class. But other teachers, and hats off to them, absolutely have taken those coloured rods and just gone into 30 students and said, I'm using a visualizer, I need you to do this, all of that. And I think if you're very clear with instructions and expectations, then it works. You can scale this up to a whole class. So there's this idea of, getting teachers to feel comfortable pushing their comfort zone, to be happy enough to try that. And something that I feel, and maybe this is a personal thing for me, but I do sort of engage in kind of coaching throughout the whole thing. So it's not a case of I'll do mine, then I'll go and sit down and just with a clipboard, mark you. It's I'm still standing around the room. The teachers will be looking up, and I'll be saying, now you want to think about moving on to this, or perhaps this is where we would go next. And I think that really brings down all the barriers. I sometimes wonder whether it's appropriate to sort of say this or not, but to be honest, this iterative lesson design experience is for the teachers. The students are getting something from it, but this is really for the teachers. And so, you often talk about breaking the fourth wall. I think sometimes the students do think, oh, this is a bit odd. Why is this strange chap now having a conversation with my teacher during this mini lesson? But again, I think that's a way of making everything feel a little bit less formal and more supportive and more structured. So yeah, teachers are only going to really thrive in terms of engaging with and learning something new if they first feel comfortable, and it's good to be challenged, but challenge doesn't need to be pressure. Challenge should come with the appropriate amount of support.
Once one group of teachers are familiar with what the expectation is, then word sort of permeates across the school, doesn't it? Because I'm just thinking, the first time you did this, I remember you were so self-deprecating that they were all like, he's not very good, is he? I was like, no, he was trying to put people at ease. I think you can't overstate the importance as well of those early adopters, and the people who can drive things forward, because like, if we think about the practicalities, timetable will normally fall to one or two people. And in as much as passing the message on will pass. And I think the hardest thing to do in schools is to get the timetable to work and to get teachers released for X, Y, and Z. And so I think there's no general, Stuart says, this is how we make this work. It's very much a case of whoever wants to drive this thinks, okay, I need a morning, how many hours? 3 hours, say? I need 3 hours. How can I find that time? How can I get people covered? What can happen in the sort of intervening period in their own classes and that kind of thing? And even if it starts on a really small scale and then grows, I don't know. I mean, do you have any thoughts about what's worked in sort of situations you've been doing this in?
Well, it's the eternal sort of resourcing challenge, isn't it? Time. We just don't have the time to do everything. But we do need to think about the actions that we believe are going to make the difference that we want to see. And for me, it always boils down to helping teachers become even better teachers. And so I would be encouraging school leaders to sort of put the money where the mouth is, type of thing, and find ways to get those teachers released. And as I say, if you're in a primary setting and the students are getting taken by a specialist teacher for something like PE or art or music or whatever it is, then that's a great opportunity. And if you do have the opportunity to have additional adults, or even what's been happening is deputy heads and heads have been stepping in and taking a class to release those teachers because they believe in the value of helping their staff improve and get better. So there are always ways of eking out that time if people really want to make it happen. And I suppose before you even look at the black and white logistics and the paper timetable, you've got to look at the will. Is the will there to make those changes? And if that exists, then those teachers will be freed up. We said about a morning there, and it has been about a morning, I think from about 9 o'clock to about 11:30 or something. That's the kind of 2.5 hour window that we've been using, and in that time we're able to do a sort of 20 or 30 minute pre-planning thing, 20-minute lesson, bit of reflection, 20-minute lesson, bit of reflection, final group of students, and then a little bit of wrap up at the end. And the fact that 3 or 4 teachers can be involved in that, it's a huge bang for your buck. If you can free up that time, just think of the difference that it could be making to those teachers, and then obviously the students as well.
And obviously PPA time is sacred, but there are ways we could get whole year groups out at the same time. So I mean, I think some schools are really good at prioritizing professional development of their teachers. It's just tough, but always worth, I suppose, talking to peers about how they manage it as well.
If you enjoy the conversations on this podcast, you'll love Hey What You Reading For, our weekly newsletter where we explore the ideas shaping education right now. Each edition brings you research, reflection, and recommendations to challenge your thinking and sharpen your practice. You can sign up for free at thinkingdeeply.info.
And so I think, like, if we compare with instructional coaching or Japanese lesson study that we've mentioned, and even more traditional workshop and then follow-up methods or models, where do you think this approach brings the sort of the added value? And is there a minimum effective dose to really shift classroom practice? Like you were saying, you were on a termly basis. What do you think? What do we think? How often should this happen? And what's the value this is bringing compared to all the other options that we've got?
From my experience so far, judging or finding the balance between what we were just discussing, which is getting teachers released and actually the capacity to do this, and then balancing that with actually having some sort of sustained impact, then I think termly feels like a good cadence. It's been working quite nicely. A sufficient amount of time has sort of passed to let things sort of digest and kind of settle and ferment. But not too much time has passed for people to have kind of forgotten the model and forgotten the flow and everything. So trying to find an opportunity to do this one morning every term, it feels like it should be doable. It feels like it should be possible. And, you know, in some ways you may be better placed to sort of comment on the differences, similarities, and the impact of this approach compared to, say, lesson study, which, you know, you've been involved in. But I suppose my general belief is that, you know, anything that gets teachers thinking about their practice, gets them out of the day-to-day, just, you know, immediacy, urgency, you know, just looking one step ahead, and allows them to just get their head up and clear their mind and think about, you know, where we're trying to get to. Anything like that is going to be beneficial. But, you know, I'm not advocating that we just go in and tell people this is how you should teach this. I think what we're trying to do here is say, here's an approach that we know is successful, but how would this look for you? You know, how do you interpret this? This is my thoughts on it. Let's try this with some students. What are your thoughts on it? How might this work for you? And in that way, I think you kind of going hand in hand. You're working with people on a kind of little bit of a journey. And yeah, you know, there's some similarities with sort of instructional coaching and other kind of approaches. But for me, this is really nice because it empowers teachers to believe that, you know, they can continue to learn and improve. It gives them some real knowledge right there, because it's you know, either subject knowledge or pedagogical approaches, whatever that is, that they've maybe not been using, that they're now learning about. And as I say, it gives them something they can go and do with their students afterwards. So you're getting all of these wonderful benefits for, when you look at it across an entire school year, 3 mornings is just a small kind of investment of time. But in terms of comparing to sort of lesson study, etc., I think you might be better placed to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think any time teachers spend talking about their practice and reflecting on their practice is time well spent. You know, there's a fair amount of zealotry in the lesson study community, with I think little unbiased and robust evidence that it actually is impactful. But it depends how you're measuring that impact. You know, so I think we focus on the fact that it's manageable, and B, the fact that you're looking at the behaviors of really effective teachers and both seeing them, which I think is crucial. You need to see those effective behaviors. You need to see that thinking, that thought process, and then you need to discuss it with the peer. I think that's where you get the benefit, you know, because I've never seen lesson study work in reality, because with the best of intentions, if it's not a priority, if someone's not emailing me to do stuff in school, then that thing's not getting done. You know, and I doubt there's many head teachers who are email, have you done your lesson study yet? You know, or have you know, I mean, instructional coaching is different because schools who do it really well carve out the time, but equally, I know schools struggle to find the time for it. You know, no matter which sort of direction we go with that, time is the optimum thing, which is why I've been asking about time quite a bit during this. You know, but I think anytime we can find to get teachers to talk about their practice, to see effective behaviors in action, and then reflect on that. You know, that's I think it's win-win. But you know, we shall see. I really appreciate the fact that you agreed to this episode with less than 2 hours notice. Normal service, so back in the office next week. But I've got one in the tank, but it has to be timed for release on the 8th. And we'll leave that mystery for listeners so they can you know, tune back in a week's time to see what that big reveal is. But yeah, so even though it's in the tank, I'm in a hotel room. I really appreciate Stuart. All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me.
You are more than welcome, Kieran. Always happy to chat with you.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.